My dad threw me out of the house to make room for my stepbrother, Brandon, his golden boy. But now, just 6 months later, they're desperate for me to lie to cover up a crime, or they'll end up in prison. I'm 18 now, having turned the corner on adulthood about 4 months back, but my dad kicked me out when I was still 17, all because Brandon, who's 24, decided to move in. Brandon didn't want to act like a regular adult and rent his own place. No, he insisted on moving back in with my dad. To give you some background, Brandon is my dad's son from his first marriage. His mom and my dad split not long after he was born. Brandon's always been closer to my dad than to his mom, so growing up, he was around all the time, more than the custody agreement required. Technically, Brandon was supposed to spend half the month with my dad, but honestly, it felt like he was with us constantly. Maybe my memory is exaggerating because I hated having him around, but it sure felt like he was a permanent fixture in my life. And let me tell you, the feeling was mutual. Brandon didn't like me either. He saw me as competition, and my dad didn't care to fix it. Things got worse after my mom passed away a couple of years ago. She fought a long battle with lung cancer, and when she was gone, the already strained relationship between me and my dad hit rock bottom. To be honest, my dad and I never had a great relationship, not even when I was little. I've always had this gut feeling that he didn't want me around. Maybe he never wanted kids at all. Growing up, my dad was constantly angry with me, snapping over the smallest things. I can't remember him ever showing me affection. No matter how hard I tried to make him proud, all I ever got from him was cold indifference. But with Brandon, it was a different story. Whenever Brandon was around, my dad transformed into the perfect father, doing all the things with him that I used to wish he'd do with me. Despite how obvious it was that Brandon and I couldn't stand each other, my dad still forced us to hang out. Brandon didn't like me because he saw me as a rival, and I couldn't stand him because he was a bully. When we were kids, he used to pick on me all the time, pushing me around just because he could. And the worst part? He knew he'd get away with it. My dad never once called him out. Whenever I tried to tell my dad how Brandon was treating me, I'd get a shrug and a lecture about toughening up. According to him, boys were supposed to roughhouse, and I needed to learn to handle it. So I stopped complaining. I figured that's what my dad wanted, so I learned to keep my head down and let Brandon do whatever he wanted. I never stood up to him, not because I couldn't, but because I knew it would only make things worse. My dad would always take Brandon's side, no matter what. It didn't matter who started it or what really happened. I was always the one to blame. It couldn't have been more obvious that my dad had a favorite, and it definitely wasn't me. Brandon could do no wrong in his eyes, even though he was 6 years older and should have known better. Over time, Brandon switched up his tactics. Physical bullying stopped working, so he got more creative. When he hit high school, he roped his friends into it. Before that, school had been my safe haven. He was in middle school while I was in elementary, so we were in different buildings. But once I entered middle school and shared the same space with him, he made sure I had no escape. Brandon and his friends made my life hell. They'd harass me every chance they got, and the rumors they spread were brutal. They told everyone I was mentally challenged, and before I knew it, I was Brandon's dumb little brother. That wasn't just a nickname, it was what everyone actually called me. I wish I were exaggerating, but I'm not. That's how they saw me. Thanks to him, they called me every offensive name you could think of, making my life unbearable. It was especially tough because, in middle school, your reputation starts to matter more than ever. Even the friends I'd had in elementary school began to drift away. They decided I wasn't cool enough to hang out with them anymore. The only relief I ever got came when Brandon finally graduated and left school. By that point, I still had a few friends, but most people had bought into the nasty rumors about me. Honestly, I just let them think whatever they wanted because I was so drained from trying to defend myself all the time. At home, things weren't any better. Brandon and my dad never missed a chance to humiliate me or make me feel small. The ironic part is I wasn't dumb, not by a long shot. I had pretty good grades and was actually pretty decent at subjects like math. But that didn't matter to either of them. Brandon was the star athlete, a football player who also happened to be a great student. He was everything I wasn't. Athletic, popular, and exactly the kind of son my dad had always wanted. And me? I was average in every way, and they never let me forget it. They constantly reminded me how ordinary and unremarkable I was. My mom tried her best to shield me, but my dad always found a way to downplay what was happening. He'd twist the situation, telling her they were just joking and didn't mean any harm. My mom was such a kind-hearted woman, but she was also deeply in love with my dad. She never really saw the side of him that I saw every day. I was grateful for the time she stood up for me, but her efforts were never enough to stop them. My dad and Brandon kept up their torment, and there wasn't much I could do about it. Eventually, Brandon left for college, and I finally got a taste of what it felt like to breathe. My dad still made my life difficult, but without Brandon around, it was at least manageable. Just as I started to adjust to this slightly less toxic version of my home life, we got hit with the worst news imaginable. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer. Her diagnosis turned our entire world upside down. The one thing my dad and I had in common was how much we both loved her, and her illness broke us in ways I can't even put into words. But instead of coming together as a family, my dad chose to pull even further away from me. Before, he at least talked to me, even if it was mostly to mock me. After my mom got sick, he barely acknowledged my existence. It was like I had become invisible to him. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself we were both struggling in our own ways and that this was just how he coped. But deep down, I'd hoped that maybe, just maybe, this tragedy might bring us closer together. Of course, that was wishful thinking. My dad was the kind of person who would actively resist anything that might make me happy, even during a time like this. As my mom's condition worsened, his behavior became harder to handle. He swung between completely ignoring me and being outright cruel. There were moments when his words cut so deep that I almost broke down in tears. I did my best to keep the peace by not reacting to him. I knew that if I pushed back, it would only give him more fuel to criticize and punish me. Surprisingly, during the years my mom was sick, whenever Brandon came home from college, he didn't pick on me. He wasn't kind by any stretch of the imagination, but at least he acted like a normal person, and that was more than I'd come to expect from him. Things were rough while my mom was still with us, but when she passed away, it felt like the ground beneath me gave out. I thought I'd been through hell before, but after she was gone, I realized I had no idea what hell really looked like. In the first couple of months after my mom passed away, the house was eerily quiet. By that, I mean I was the one doing everything, cleaning, cooking laundry, while my dad barely acknowledged my existence. He went through the motions, working, coming home, eating dinner, and that was it. He was completely detached, like a robot just running on autopilot. I started to get worried and called my grandparents a few times to tell them I thought he might be depressed, but they brushed me off. I don't know if they just didn't care about their son enough to check on him after the funeral, or if they disliked me as much as he did and didn't want to listen to anything I had to say. Either way, they never came. A few months later, my dad slowly returned to his usual self. Unfortunately, that also meant drinking too much and making me feel worthless all over again. He started barking orders at me constantly, expecting me to handle everything around the house. It was exhausting. I was juggling school and all the household chores that my mom used to take care of, even when she was sick. Back when she was alive, my dad and I had shared the responsibilities. But after she was gone, everything fell squarely on me. Whenever I tried to push back, even a little, he'd shut me down with the same line. "You're not bringing any money into this house, so this is the least you can do to earn your keep." It was humiliating, but I had nowhere else to go, so I swallowed my pride and endured it. The one thing that kept me going was the thought of college. I'd dream about the day I could leave for good and never look back. The house stopped feeling like home the day my mom died, anyway. Sure, I could have gone to live with my mom's parents, but they lived so far away, and I still had a year left of high school. It just wasn't an option. But then, 2 months ago, my dad gave me no choice. When he found out his golden boy, Brandon, was planning to move back in, he decided I had to go. He kicked me out without hesitation, and I ended up moving in with my grandparents after all. Brandon hadn't lived with us since he went off to college. After graduating, he got a job in another city and decided to settle there with his girlfriend, who didn't want to move back home. For a while, he only came around for the holidays. About 2 years ago, his girlfriend got pregnant, so they decided to get married. I was surprised when I got an invite to the wedding, but even more shocked when Brandon didn't say a single mean thing to me that day. My mom, despite her illness, made it to the wedding as well because everyone, even Brandon, respected and adored her. Brandon never had much of a relationship with his own mother. To put it bluntly, she wasn't exactly a shining example of maternal care. By the time he got married, she was on her 4th husband. She was successful, sure. She made good money, but her focus was always on her career and, frankly, herself. She didn't seem to care much about Brandon as a person, which is probably why he latched on so hard to our dad. In Brandon's eyes, my dad was the only real parent he had, and it was clear he didn't want to share him with me. After Brandon got married, he and his wife stayed in their city and seemed happy. They had their baby, built a life, and didn't give any indication they were planning to move back. But then, 6 months ago, Brandon decided to return home, and my dad let me know about it 2 weeks before he arrived. He didn't break the news kindly either. He sat me down one day, looking all smug, and told me I needed to start packing because Brandon and his family were moving in, and I was being booted out. I asked why they couldn't just use the guest room. After all, we had 3 bedrooms. But my dad had it all figured out. Brandon and his wife would take the guest room, and my bedroom was going to be converted into a nursery for their baby. He told me it was time for me to leave anyway. According to him, I'd lived there long enough, and since I was about to turn 18 in a few months, there was no reason for me to stay any longer. I thought it was incredibly selfish of him to throw me out just because Brandon wanted to move back, but arguing with him was useless. His mind was made up, and there was no changing it. He gave me 2 weeks to get out, and if I didn't, he said he'd call the cops. Thinking back now, I realized there probably was some legal way to fight back and stop him from doing this, but at the time I didn't even consider it. I was absolutely terrified. I didn't trust my dad at all, and I knew he wouldn't hesitate to toss me out without a second thought. So, I scrambled to figure out where I could go. In the end, I decided to move in with my grandparents. I'd avoided this option before, because they lived so far away, and I still needed to finish school. But by that point, I had no choice. Luckily, the school year was almost over, just a couple of weeks left, so I figured I could make it work. Within a few days, I had packed up my life and left, mostly because I didn't want to be there when Brandon came back with his wife and kid. My dad? He didn't care at all. He didn't even bother saying goodbye. On moving day, I was getting ready to leave with the movers when my grandparents pulled up in their truck to pick me up. They were furious and ready to confront my dad right then and there, but I begged them not to. It just wasn't worth it. That was 6 months ago, and since then, I've been staying with my grandparents. I haven't spoken to my dad since he threw me out, and honestly, I had no plans to reach out to him, ever. I was about to start college in a few weeks, and I was determined to leave my dad and Brandon behind me for good. As far as I was concerned, they were out of my life. Unfortunately, that didn't last. Out of nowhere, they were the ones who reached out to me because apparently they needed my help. A few days ago, they actually showed up at my grandparents' house, which caught me completely off guard. I never expected them to contact me, let alone show up in person. My grandparents let them in, and even though I had no desire to talk to them, I decided to hear them out. They looked desperate. That's when I found out why Brandon and his family had moved back in the first place. Turns out, Brandon had lost his job and couldn't afford his rent anymore, so he decided to move back home. His wife didn't mind the move, since she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom until their child was older, so it seemed like the best option for them. They thought it would be easy for Brandon to find a new job once they got back, but it wasn't. None of the local companies were hiring, and there were plenty of candidates with his same qualifications. Eventually, my dad managed to pull some strings and got Brandon a job at his company. It wasn't a great job. The pay was lower than what Brandon had been making before, but it was the only thing he could get, so he took it. Unfortunately, that's where things went from bad to worse. As it turns out, Brandon had been stealing money from the company for months, and a few weeks ago, he got caught. Now both Brandon and my dad were in serious trouble because the company believed they had been working together to embezzle funds. They were on the verge of being taken to court if they didn't pay back the money. The only reason they hadn't already been sued was because the CEO of the company had been close friends with my mom. Out of respect for her memory, the CEO was holding off on filing charges. But that wasn't going to last forever, and now Brandon and my dad were desperate for a way out. That's why they had come to see me. They wanted me to lie to help them. The plan? They wanted me to tell the CEO that the stolen money had been used to pay for my college tuition, not for their personal gain. They thought this would make the CEO more sympathetic and buy them some time to pay the money back. They figured they'd still lose their jobs, but at least they'd avoid jail time. They expected me to help them spin this story, to play the role of the poor, struggling son who needed the money. I couldn't believe their nerve. After all the years of mistreating me, after throwing me out like trash, they had the audacity to come to me now. asking for my help. I turned them down almost immediately, without even giving it much thought. The whole plan was ridiculous, and I couldn't see how it would ever work. It was so absurd that I wanted no part of it. When I told them I wasn't going to help cover up their crime, they started panicking. They tried to guilt-trip me, saying I had an obligation to help them because there was a real possibility they could end up in prison. They insisted I couldn't let some petty grudge from the past destroy their lives. That's when I snapped back and told them this wasn't some petty grudge, and it certainly wasn't in the past. My dad had kicked me out less than a year ago. How was I supposed to act like that didn't just happen? It was still a raw wound. But even that wasn't the main reason I refused to help them. What really made me say no was how unfair it all felt. On top of that, I personally knew the CEO of my dad's company, the person they had stolen from. As I mentioned before, this man had been a close friend of my mom's. He practically grew up with her, and I even used to call him Uncle when I was younger. I remember him coming over to visit while my mom was still alive, and even at her funeral, he and I had a nice, heartfelt conversation. In fact, he was the one who gave my dad a job at his company because my mom asked him to help when my dad was struggling. And now, after all of that, Brandon decided to steal from him, and my dad thought I'd be okay with lying to protect them? The idea of being part of that kind of deception made me sick. So I told them straight up that they should focus on returning the money instead of digging themselves into an even deeper hole with more lies. I warned them that trying to deceive the CEO again could land them in even more trouble. They didn't seem to grasp how lucky they were to have the chance to pay the money back and walk away without a lawsuit. If the CEO hadn't been a family friend, they would probably already be facing charges for embezzlement. A lawsuit would ruin them. It would almost certainly mean prison time. I tried to explain all of this, but my dad cut me off, getting angrier by the second. He told me he didn't come here for a lecture. He came because he needed my help. He said that if I really wanted to help, I'd agree to their plan instead of giving useless advice. That's when I told him, point blank, that I wasn't going to do it. To my surprise, my dad started crying. I had never seen him cry before in my life, and honestly, it made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. He told me he was counting on me, that I was his son, and no matter what had happened in the past, he would have helped me if I were in the same situation. He said he expected me to do the same for him now because he was in serious trouble and didn't want to go to prison. Brandon chimed in, practically begging me to help. He said my mom's friend trusted me and liked me, and I was the only one who could get them out of this mess. Brandon even went so far as to say my mom would have handled this if she were still alive, but since she wasn't, I was the only person they could turn to. It was heartbreaking, but I still refused. I tried, once again, to convince them to take responsibility and return the stolen money. But they were furious. They said the only reason I didn't want to help them was because I was holding on to bitterness from when they mistreated me as a kid. They accused me of being vindictive and said they were disappointed in me. Eventually, they left, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. The guilt is eating me alive. I keep picturing them in prison, and it makes me feel awful. But at the same time, I know I can't be part of something illegal and immoral. It would be a betrayal of my mom's memory, too, exploiting her friendship with the CEO and manipulating someone she cared about. Now I'm stuck. I don't know what to do, and time is running out. Does it make me a bad person if I can't bring myself to lie and cover for my dad and stepbrother, the same people who bullied me my whole life? I've made my decision, and I'm sticking to it. I won't help my dad or Brandon. What they're asking me to do is not only unethical, but blatantly illegal, and I refuse to be dragged into their mess. If they want to avoid going to prison, they'll need to figure it out on their own. They've already been given the opportunity to fix things. They just need to return the money Brandon stole and resolve the situation themselves. There's absolutely no reason for me to feel guilty about this. And honestly, it's not just because of how badly they've treated me over the years. What they did was genuinely awful, and I couldn't live with myself if I helped cover it up. My conscience doesn't work the same way theirs does, and I don't want to compromise my morals just to save them from the consequences of their actions. That's why I've chosen to stay out of it entirely. If they try to contact me again, I'll block them without hesitation. For reference, they're already blocked on every platform, but I wouldn't be surprised if they found other ways to reach me, through different numbers or fake social media accounts. My grandparents support my decision completely. They believe that my dad and Brandon created this mess, and it's their responsibility to clean it up. Expecting me to step in after everything they've done to me? That's just absurd. As if on cue, my dad reached out to me today, just like I expected he might. It's been 8 days since he showed up at my grandparents' house, and we haven't spoken since. This time, he used an unknown number to call me, and out of habit, I picked up. The moment I heard his voice, I hung up immediately, but before I could block the number, he managed to send me a text. In the message, he said he knew I didn't want to talk about this anymore, but he and Brandon were in serious trouble. Their employer was pressuring them every day and threatening to file a lawsuit if they didn't pay back the stolen money. Reading that made me feel a pang of guilt, but I stuck to my decision. I replied, telling him I couldn't help and that he needed to focus on finding a way to repay the money instead of trying to manipulate the CEO. After that, I blocked his number again. I hope he finally understands why I'm doing this. Even if he doesn't, I just want him to take responsibility and avoid prison. So far, I haven't heard anything else from him, but my grandparents decided to contact the CEO directly to get an update on the situation. We'd avoided reaching out to him before because he's an incredibly busy man, and we didn't want to burden him with more than he was already dealing with. But at this point, we needed to know what his plans were since talking to my dad or Brandon wasn't an option anymore. My grandfather spoke with the CEO, who said he still intends to file a lawsuit if the money isn't returned in the next couple of months. He told us that he's only held off on pressing charges out of respect for my mom, but he can't forgive the debt. And honestly, I completely respect that. He's already shown far more patience and leniency than most people would in this situation. During the conversation, he even apologized to me, saying he was sorry I had to go through all of this. I told him it wasn't a big deal for me anymore. I don't live with my dad, and frankly, my dad deserves whatever's coming to him. We don't know exactly how this will play out, but I think my dad is smart enough to realize he needs to find a way to pay back the money if he wants to avoid prison. It won't be easy, but they'll figure it out eventually, and I have no reason to worry about it anymore. While talking to the CEO, he mentioned something that really touched me. He told me that before she passed away, my mom had spoken to him about me. She asked him to look out for me if I ever needed help, like offering me an internship or guiding me in my career. He told me he'd be more than happy to honor her request, and hearing that was incredibly comforting. Even after her passing, my mom is still looking out for me, and that thought fills me with so much gratitude. It's a reminder that her love and care didn't end when she left this world, and that gives me a sense of peace and happiness I didn't think I'd feel after everything that's happened.